Hi, I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt, where I interview guests who are researchers and practitioners in the area of compassion and self-compassion. Sometimes I also do video essays on topics related to the science and practice of compassion. But at the moment, I'm enjoying interviewing guests from all around the world. Dr. Wendy Wood is a therapist, teacher, lecturer at the Compassionate Mind Foundation. She's the program leader and training advisor for the Diploma of Compassion Focused Therapy. She's taught and supervised psychotherapy and counselling students, originally at the University of Derby, but's been with the Compassionate Mind Foundation since 2021 and helped coordinate and design the Diploma of CFT over the last couple of years. The thing that really stood out for me in my conversation with Wendy was the way that she brings the wisdom and warmth of compassion-focused therapy to the training of compassion-focused therapists. And she offered some great reminders about what it is to be an adult learner. And so I bring you Dr. Wendy Wood. Okay, well, Dr. Wendy Wood, welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thanks, Dan. It's so good to be here. I've watched a lot of your episodes and they're just great. So thanks very much for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm excited to speak with you today. Can you tell us, to get us started, just tell us a little bit about what drew you to compassion-focused therapy, or how you became kind of perhaps aware of it and so involved, and maybe, how you sort of see it as a crucial approach maybe in modern psychotherapy, one worth disseminating. Tell us about all of that.
Yeah, well, it was actually it was quite accidental. It wasn't a planned sort of I'll go and listen to Paul Gilbert or anything. Been working at the university for 20 years, and as you probably know, Paul also worked at the university for a long time, and our paths never really crossed. So I was looking after a number of counselling and psychotherapy programs. And my colleague said to me, Professor Gilbert would like to develop a formal course in compassion focused therapy. And so we were at the time revalidating a CBT course. So it kind of fitted with our schedule. And I said, fine, that's great. I didn't know much about it. So I thought, well, if we're going to be validating a program, I'd better go and find out what it's all about, you see.
Right.
So,
Yes.
so I went to one of Paul's workshops. And to be honest, I was just kind of quite blown away by it. And the reason was because my initial approach was integrative. So that was integrating CBT, person-centered and attachment theory. That was my training. So I'd thought, that's a really good integration. And it wasn't a theoretical integration. It wasn't a kind of eclectic pick and mix. So I was feeling reasonably happy with that. But then when I listened to Paul, I suddenly sort of appreciated that the evolutionary model and the reason behind why we do what we do was what was missing from my integration.
Mm-hmm.
So the understandings that neuroscience brings into it, the understandings that, say, evolutionary theory, some of the Jungian concepts that come into it, all of those sort of things. And I thought, wow, this is quite incredible. So then what happened was, as part of developing the course, my manager said, because Paul is all over the world, we're going to need somebody that understands the model. So will you do the course, the first course as a student? So So I
Wow.
had a marvelous opportunity to do the first iteration of a student, and I was delighted to have a honorary contract with our local healthcare trust to be able to get the clinical hours in. And so it kind of evolved. And as I developed my skills, it really did make a solid contribution to my work as a therapist and a supervisor as well. So so I was kind of sold on that. And then I ended up program leading the course from then on in.
Mm.
Um,
Mm.
so apart from the fact that it's a sort of real connection with these different theories, it's also about saying it's more than just a set of techniques, which I believe psychotherapy is. I'm into sort of process notions of therapy rather than applied techniques. And that's what really drew me, is saying this was a complete theory of mind, not just, you're suffering from anxiety, so we'll train you to work on that. It's actually understanding the mind, and that's what really drew me to it.
Yes, Professor Paul Gilbert, he really has developed this whole integrative model of the mind, hasn't he? And when we hear him speak about it, it's very inspiring and thought provoking, and all of a sudden pieces are falling into place almost. And you mentioned that evolutionary element to it, and the idea of understanding sort of the reason behind why we're feeling things or thinking things or doing things, understanding those motives or motivations behind things and the evolved motives. It just seems such yeah, for me too. It's almost like that was a gap, and it just really made a very helpful addition to perhaps the mini integration I was already doing, but to be able to bring in this sort of Paul Gilbert version of integration, it filled a lot of gaps.
Yeah, and it's a kind of the way he's developed that is that it is a framework. So it helps to make sense of why you're integrating what you're integrating,
Hmm.
rather than going on gut reaction, I guess. It's about saying, I understand what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, or why I'm not doing it for that matter,
Mm.
both as a clinician as well as a human being, that you
Mm.
have some understanding about why you might be behaving in the way you're behaving.
Yes, and it does apply to supervision, doesn't it? You mentioned in your therapy work, but also supervision. But it's sort of it can be helpful sometimes in supervision or working with other therapists just to pause and have a little bit of a think. Like what are you noticing in your own mind right now? What are the three circles doing? Sort of right now in this moment, or perhaps in a moment where the supervisee is working with the client and sort of noticing perhaps threat system activation that might be happening between client and
Mm.
clinician as much as just working from the client point of view.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's really essential. And it's another thing that is important about the model for me, is that it is important to learn it from the inside out, as
Hmm.
our colleague Russell Colts and co talk about, is that the more you understand yourself and have some awareness, the more able you are to be helpful towards others, because you get your own motives and fears, blocks, and resistances that are going on.
Mm. Yes, I'd like to come back to some of the fears, blocks, and resistances a bit later when it comes to training
Mm.
therapists in CFT. But you mentioned, I think you were referring to the University of Derby there. You've since moved to running this diploma of compassion focused therapy at the Compassionate Mind Foundation, as I understand it. And I wondered if you could just describe the diploma course for us. What are the key components there, and perhaps some, sort of how do you kind of go about the training of CFT therapists?
Yeah, right. Well, I think moving away from the university has been tremendously helpful in some respects.
Hmm.
And the reason I say that is not because anything wrong with university or any university for that matter. However, one of the issues that I've found over the years, because I've always worked with postgraduate students, is on the whole, universities are very much set up for undergraduate students. So all the processes and the rules and regulations are all geared to undergrads.
I see. Hmm.
Now, now the difficulty with that is when people are adult learners, postgraduate, working full time, senior clinicians usually, because our course is for people that are already qualified. We don't train people from scratch. Then they have complex lives, and the clients that they need to do the course with to get the hours also have complex lives. So some of the systems that evolve in universities don't really help. So, for example, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but certainly in the UK, if you can't get a piece of work in on time, then you have to go through all kinds of bureaucratic processes to demonstrate why you
Hmm.
can't get the piece of work in on time, and then you're given a deadline to get the work in. So, so the difficulty with that, if you think about it from a CFT perspective, is it means it puts you in a condition of threat. Having to make the time, having to get the clinical hours in, having to get the assignments in, as well as managing complex casework and complex life. So, but we had to do that when we were at the university because otherwise we couldn't give people the award unless they did those things. So, because these days we are not attached to the university, we are approved by the British Psychological Society. We have a lot more flexibility. So, can actually say to people, we would give you deadlines. So, the assignments come in January and then again in May. However, if you cannot get them in, you don't have to demonstrate to me that you can't get them in or sort of ask me for extensions. You just tell me or tell us that you can't submit at this time and then work out a time when it's feasible for you to submit. Because if I can keep people out of their threat system, then they stand a better chance of learning.
Mm.
So, that's really valuable to be able to do that.
I really love
It isn't possible.
I
Go
love
on.
the sound of that because yes, at university is a real sort of threat-based drive place, isn't it? There's this sort of
Mm,
threat system activation, which is sometimes ramped up by the system itself and all of these rules and regulations, as you say, and then people are kind of, in drive system mode to try to kind of overcompensate for that almost, or
mm,
there's all that
yeah.
perfectionism that drives people in some of those places, but it's very threat-based drive. It sounds like keeping the three circles model that we all know and love in mind. You're trying to sort of move from threat system to soothing affiliative system for people, and
Mm,
the students are able to have that sense of connection and safeness and so on in the course, and move on into drive from there. So they're actually coming at the to accomplish something and to have successes and so on, but they're coming to that drive system from a soothing affiliative kind of foundation, which that just seems invaluable, really.
yeah, and that's what people are very clear about when they come on the course. That's what they feed back, that it's probably the first time that they've been able to experience a course from that kind of caring motivation rather than threat-based fear.
Mm,
So, threat-based drive, sorry.
mm.
So, and the other things that we do, which we have the flexibility to do, is again, in universities, you have to grade because people need a certain level of grade to get the award. But we don't have to. So one of the things I observed when I was working at the university was people would look at their feedback, but all they would see is the grade. So if we were grading, say, 60% out of 100, that's what they would look at. So then they would immediately, well, very often, they would go into their own self-critic. Why didn't I do better? Or, I'm not sure that I deserve this, if they're, feeling undeserving. Then they don't have the space to pay attention to the rest of the feedback. That's all that stays in their mind. So we decided that we wouldn't grade either, because there's no need. People have already been through those kind of hoops anyway. So it's simply pass or resubmit. And I've actually changed that over the past year as a result of feedback from our trainees, because I was institutionalized into university speak and language just as much as most of us.
Yes.
And so originally I said, it's pass or fail. Now, if you fail, that doesn't mean, it's horrendous. It just means that you may have to really tune into whatever you've missed out of the assignment. And then I'll ask you to agree a time when it's useful to resubmit. And, we'll take it from there. But it was the word fail that really, stuns people. And of course, it probably relates to earlier learning experiences that people have had. So, so this year we've changed it to pass or resubmit. So it's less threatening to receive.
Yeah, no, I can appreciate that you're really focusing on even just the nuance of that, the nuance of kind of the languaging of things and how to describe it. Isn't it funny how when we just pass something in the graded system, we criticize ourselves for not doing well enough. And when we do very, very well at a subject and get really high grades, we feel like we didn't deserve it, or we were just lucky, or we find some other way to discount it. It's just so fascinating how the mind works, and being able to be aware of that, aware of the threat system and the self-criticism and the undeservedness, as you said. Well, you've designed a kind of a training program that helps people to kind of, what would you say, sort of, well, not have to deal with any of that, and just learn from a place of safeness.
Yeah, I mean, that's the aim is, we start from a position of saying, what would it be like if you could be a compassionate learner? And what would it be like if we could develop this course to be as compassionate as it could be? So that begins that kind of dialogue and that thinking around how we can create that community and atmosphere of a genuine wish to bring compassion to learning.
Yes, what would it be like to be a compassionate learner? Just starting to envision that, and right from the outset, by the sounds of it, having the compassion itself sort of alongside, I guess, on that learning journey.
Yeah, very much so.
And so what happens next then for people as they perhaps enter the course and so on? Are there sort of certain, is it like coursework, or is there certain steps along the way? How does that all work?
Well, what happens is, because we designed the course to make it as accessible as possible, because so many people want to learn. the model from different countries, and not all countries have their own formal training at the moment. So the way we designed it was to say, right, if we can make it accessible to as many people as possible across the world, that's what we'll do. So it can be delivered all online. But what was important was it being a distant course. It's more about still having that sense of connection with the course, because that's the model itself, is that we're better when we're connected. So what we do is there's a series of masterclasses. So roughly every 2 weeks there's a masterclass, and that's lasts all day. But for people that can't get there live because of work patterns or time zone differences, then they're all recorded. So as long as people can catch up with them at some point, they don't have to be there live. And then to facilitate that connection so that people feel that they are part of something that they can learn from and learn with, before the masterclass, the week before the masterclass, what we do is we invite people to meet together in groups. They're supervision groups, actually, which are no more than 4 people. And we say, read the chapter or the article that is based on the next week's masterclass. So, for example, one of the masterclasses is the therapeutic relationship in CFT.
Mm-hmm.
So the week before, we asked people to read the chapter from the edited Gilbert and Simos book, and say, right, read that chapter and make your own notes, nothing formal, just make some notes, and we give them some prompts. So thinking about, what does the chapter mean to you personally? What does it mean to your clinical practice? What surprises you about the chapter? Is there anything that confuses you about the chapter? Anything you need further information on? So those are roughly the prompts that we give them. So everybody reads a chapter individually, and then they come together in a group, and they share their thoughts on that chapter. So once they've done that, they then spend some more time seeing an element of CFT that they want to really hone and to improve. So it might be explaining the model to their clients, or guiding a practice or something like that. So then they can support each other and give each other compassionate feedback. Then they nominate a person to summarize what happened in their group. And then they put that summary on our learning platform, which is called Thinkific. So then on the learning platform, we have all the recordings of the masterclasses, all the handouts, and we have this side where people have written about their experience of that chapter. So then what that means is that people can get some ideas on how people are responding to that chapter from different contexts. So it widens your understanding. So you may be working with somebody from a forensic setting, or from a general mental health setting, or from a different country. And so people are going to have a different take on that chapter, and their own experience, of course. So that really enriches the learning experience, and also means that people, rather than doing what, well, certainly I tend to do, I have to admit, is if I go to a workshop or a conference, people will always say, oh, this is a good book, or this is a good paper. And I walk away and think, yes, I'm going to read that. So I usually buy them, loads of books, loads of articles, and then I don't necessarily get around to reading them.
Yes.
But when you're working in a small group, you're more motivated because you want to support the group, so you will do the reading. And then what it does is it means that people are prepared for the masterclass because they're already aware of what they need to clarify. And if some of them can't be there live, then somebody else can ask questions on their behalf, or they can email me and say, can you make sure this question was asked? So it really deepens the learning in that respect, and it creates this community of learning. So the approach isn't something that I have devised. It's patchwork text, it's called. So it's quite often used in different university settings. So the reason it's called patchwork is because each little piece of work that people write individually and they share with other people, you kind of stitch it together, as it were, as if you're building a quilt.
Yeah.
So, and then, you know, we build a quilt of knowledge, if you will. So that's the idea of doing that. And then on the weeks when they're not in their reading groups, they stay together as the group of, say, no more than 4. And then they're in a supervision session. So they spend 2 hours every 2 weeks in supervision. So, so they spend a fair amount of time together in small groups, as well as in the larger group.
In the masterclass. Yeah, I like the idea of sort of patchwork learning, was it? Or patchwork?
Patchwork text, it's called.
Patchwork text. Yeah, I was going to say cross-fertilizing, but I think patchwork is much nicer, probably. But yeah, that idea of just learning together, learning off each other, being able to kind of, you know, think things through, discuss it, you know, write it down, read other people. I must admit, I when I interviewed Nikki Petrocchi, for example, on this channel a little while ago, that it was just so wonderful to dive into their meta-analyses and, you know, have a chance to really read it and then really talk about it, you know, not least with one of the authors. So that was a real benefit. But, you know, I could feel the much greater learning there compared to, as you say, you go to a workshop, you feel very inspired and it's really interesting and so on. And then you go back to work and it's hard to, you know, stay engaged with the reading and the learning and so on. And so I think the therapeutic relationship chapter, was that by Dr. Hannah Gilbert in the edited book?
It was, yes.
Yeah. So that is a wonderful chapter. I interviewed Professor Grigoris Simosh just last week about that
Oh, right.
edited book. So that's sort of out there with that conversation with him as well. What just give us a bit of a flavour. What are some of the other masterclass topics? Just if you can think of some off the top of your head.
Right. Well, in the first semester, it's really focusing on the theory and practice, underpinning theory and practice. So Paul Gilbert will do all of those. So he'll be looking at, as they developing the therapeutic relationship, looking at shame, looking at guilt, looking at fears, blocks, and resistances, for example. And some of the other elements of CFT. So that's the first semester. And then in the second semester, after around January, we have guest speakers that come along. And so what they do is I try to invite people who can talk to issues that we're all likely to come across in our work as therapists. So not too specialized, because, you know, Compassionate Mind Foundation has lots of workshops if you want to really specialize, say, on eating disorders or forensics, for example.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
If we can really kind of think about things that we're all likely to experience. So we have Tobin Bell that does chair work, and I know you've had Tobin on the channel.
Yes, yeah.
And we have Russell Colt. So Russell does anger with us. And we have Derek Greiner and Mark Beecher and Davy Erickson, and they were three of the team from Salt Lake, Utah, that wrote the book on compassion-focused therapy for group work. So they do, three of them present with us on that day to experience group work. And Dr. Deborah Lee doing trauma. So, oh, and so I should miss out Dr. Andrew Rayner, who also does dissociation with us.
Oh, okay.
So those are the main themes of the masterclasses.
Some of the themes are sort of technique oriented, like the chair work sort of stuff, and some of the masterclasses might be sort of transdiagnostic kind of topics like trauma or shame. Yes, a number of the sort of the sort of researchers, practitioners of CFT come along and do their sort of guest lectures. You mentioned the supervision. So sounds like there's a very clinical or applied part of it as well. How does that, there's the theoretical part and the learning and the master classes. How does the applied part also work?
The people who come on the course to begin with are experienced clinicians, so have at least 3 years experience as a therapist. So, we're not training people from the beginnings of being a therapist. However, what they're looking towards is actually integrating CFT into their practice, developing more of a CFT focus into their work. So what that means is that they need specific supervision and guidance to do that. So they're allocated to an experienced CFT therapist for the whole of the course to help them to shape their work, to develop their CFT practice. So what they do is they meet for 2 hours on every 2 weeks, where they share their cases and discuss their cases and develop their skills that way, as well as integrating the theory from what they're learning in the masterclasses. They also really log their clinical hours, so they have a special workbook that we provide them with. So they log their clinical hours and reflect on how CFT is shaping their practice, and they log their clinical supervision hours as well. So they do 40 hours minimum of clinical practice and 20 hours of clinical supervision.
Yeah, so there really is a kind of a learning, practicing, embodying kind of flow there that sort of, they learn a bit about it from the theory from Paul. They get to sort of learn more in the master classes, but also sort of start to practice it and kind of get some feedback, and then they start to really implement and embody it into their clinical work. There's a real deliberate practice kind of element by the sounds of it, really being able to stop and reflect as much as sort of the learning.
And then the assignments also reflect that. So the first assignment is a case study. So they actually work with a case that they are thinking about in terms of CFT to reflect on how they were able to use CFT with that particular client, and what went well, and what they've learned from that case, and how they can improve. So that's the first assignment. And then the second assignment is a role play, where they look at demonstrating an aspect of CFT with another person that they're working with in their supervision group. So then that they can reflect and analyse what they did and how well they did it. So they might, for example, demonstrate explaining 3 circles to a client, role play, and so they'll record that for 20 minutes and then analyze what they notice. So so it's very much sort of really focused on developing them as clinicians.
Yes, through practice, reflection, and feedback. I remember when I was first exposed to CFT, and it would have been a Paul Gilbert workshop as well. I think it was 2014, I think it was, when I saw Paul down in Byron Bay here in Australia. And I noticed two tricky bits arose for me. One was, like you said, just the extent of his theoretical understanding and his integration of a whole range of different areas of science and psychological science and the wisdom traditions and so on, and feeling sort of almost in awe of that, but also slightly overwhelmed. And then the other bit that was tricky was sort of my own fears, blocks, and resistances, I would say, especially to self-compassion, and just noticing, feeling a little bit kind of, shouldn't I be compassionate towards others? Like it's not really about being compassionate towards myself type of a block. And I was wondering, what do you notice with some of the trainees? Are there certain common challenges that arise? How do people go, kind of first meeting some of the theory and perhaps even some of those fears, blocks, and resistances?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And I felt the same too. And I suppose that's one of the important lessons, is helping people to understand that they're not alone, that we all experience these fears, blocks, and resistances. And I think that there's one thing to understand that from a theoretical point of view, or thinking about from our clinical work, but there's another layer to it to actually really embody it yourself and say, do you know what? I'm not the only person that gets overwhelmed by different aspects of learning or the course. So from that point of view, yes, I think common things that crop up for people is about, wow, there's no way I'm going to learn all this. It's so complicated. And, Paul's such a genius, there's no way.
Yeah.
So, so, that's what we kind of need to work through in terms of saying, how do we apply the model to ourselves as learners, as compassionate learners? What would help us to manage those moments of overwhelm? Because if they get in the way, if they block the learning, then it's difficult. So how can we overcome that? How can we use the practices that we're learning on ourselves to be able to reduce the suffering that we're going through as we're maybe comparing ourselves with Paul or somebody else? As we're sitting there trying to manage life, everything else, and needing to read all these complex chapters.
Yeah.
And so we spend a lot of time thinking about that and helping people to slow down when there might be an actual tendency to speed up. I've got to read this, and I've got to read that, and I've got to do this. And sometimes I'm kind of one of the phrases, I like kind of phrases that people use. They stay with me, and there's one that I frequently use in the training, and it's not mine. It belongs to Dr. Dennis Turch, actually.
Ah, yes.
And he said this phrase when he was introducing a symposium at one of the Compassionate Mind annual conferences. And he said, we've got a lot to get through, so we'd better slow down. And I thought that was so fantastic, because that's exactly what I spend a lot of time doing, when I'm supporting the trainees, and I can see them get more and more kind of wound up and speeding up. And I was like, whoa, just slow down.
Yes.
We know from the three circles that if you just let go, then you're more likely to be able to take on board the theory and the practice. And if you don't, then it takes time.
Mm.
And the other phrase that comes to mind is from Paul, where he'll say, it takes time to learn these things. You'll be a better CFT practitioner after you've done this course, but you'll be even better in 10 years' time. But you can't move from now to 10 years overnight. So, and that's our motivation, is just to gradually improve as much as we can.
Mm.
And some process can't be rushed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, there are some really good reminders there. We've got a lot to get through, so we really need to slow down, which I love and has a lot of wisdom in it. And also, yeah, it'll take time, and that's okay. It's sort of I think for me, and perhaps I get a sense from how you're describing it there too, that a lot of us, it is a social comparison thing, and it's kind of a shame thing, isn't it? I remember feeling like, oh my goodness, I'm not sure if I can get my head around the neuroscience here and all this stuff about heart rate variability and what that means about parasympathetic nervous system
Yeah.
and you sort of almost feel that self-consciousness or even the shame that
Mm.
I feel a bit inadequate or not good enough. I do remember Paul saying to me about those aspects of CFT. He sort of said a similar thing. He sort of said, look, don't worry about that for now. Basically he said, just
Mm.
really focus on the bits that seem to be really applicable for your work and the rest will come, sort of thing.
Mm.
That was soothing at the time to just soften this little shame thing that was entering the
Mm.
fray.
Yeah, and as I was talking about earlier, we perhaps understand where that comes from, given
Mm,
our earlier learning experiences. If you have experienced a kind of shaming learning experience or a threat based,
mm,
then you kind of can bring those memories with you. So
mm,
that's why it's valuable to work on those from a CFT perspective, just to kind of settle them, to allow you the
mm.
space to really see that you're doing the best you can. We're all doing the best that we can. That's the model. We just have
Yeah.
these tricky brains that make it difficult sometimes.
Yes, I've just
And
had
and
a.
you know that's
Mm, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, and that's the other value. And this is what the trainees say about having the case study, the role play at the end, the final assignment. Because once they focus on that, they realise that they have come a long way, even if at the time they feel as though maybe they haven't. But
Mm,
it's quite incredible the journey that they make and the insights that they get.
mm,
Um, and it's also knowing that we're never cooked, are we? We never can call ourselves, I know it all now.
yes.
We're constantly learning, particularly as therapists. You know,
Yeah.
science is always changing. The work you do is always changing. You're changing as a person, because as you move through your developmental stages in life, you change.
Mm,
So, all of that brings a richness to the work that we do.
mm,
And so it's to be kind of celebrated, rather than saying, oh, I don't know this, I don't know that, but
mm.
you may know
That's
it in the
true.
future.
It's actually a really wonderful aspect to the work that we do, isn't it? Is that we kind of get to always keep learning and keep practicing
Mhm.
and shifting and changing and creating new directions and that sort of thing. Um, I did have a little insight before, if you'll indulge me. I mean, I just had this flashback to I was a terrible speller in early primary school, and I remember one day where my grade 4 teacher sort of told me that I was spelling my last name wrongly. And I have a funny last name, Steindl, and she felt it should have been I before E or something, I think. And I felt a bit devastated, but it turned out in the end that I was spelling my name right after all. But I think
Mm.
it did lay down a little bit of a sort of that centrality thing that Dr.
Mm.
Marcella
Mm.
Matos talks about with those
Mm.
experiences where the shaming experiences become central to our identity, and we start to just
Yeah.
think that we're not a good speller or a good learner, and then it
Mm.
pops up its head again every now and then when you're learning something new.
Yes, I can empathise with that. I have the same issue with number. You know, I've never
Mm,
been um, good at maths, and there are good reasons for that. But, um, it's quite difficult to kind of realise that you kind of struggle quite a lot. So then, if you're not careful, you avoid doing the
yes,
statistics to look at the research and things like that. So
yes, yes,
it
yes,
takes some work to stay with it, doesn't it? To
yeah.
recognise where that all comes from.
What about the other side too? That because these are the trainees are experienced clinicians. Often, they've been around the block and they've learnt lots of things. And do you notice that even there people can sort of struggle with some of the classic fears, blocks, and resistances to compassion and
Mm.
self-compassion, and that's part of the work too?
Yes, I think very much so. I tend to think that the way people develop in CFT or other modalities for that is that it is a bit like layers of an onion,
Mm,
or certainly it is for me, where, you go through trainings and maybe your own therapy, and you think, yes, I'm getting this together. I understand what's going on and I can bring compassion to it. And then every now and again, some other bit bubbles up to the surface and you get triggered. And
yes.
you need to go through another round of thinking, oh my gosh, what does this mean? So, I use myself as an example, because then I can give myself consent to
Yes, fair
use it.
enough.
So, I was, let's say over the years, I'd been a therapist for about 25 years when I started with CFT. And I'd had various, rounds of personal therapy as part of my training, and, at times when I felt I needed it. So, as much as anybody could be, I thought I was relatively okay, And I'll never forget, we were on a 3-day workshop with Paul at the beginning of the course, and he demonstrated an aspect of CFT in a role play with somebody. And I think it was maybe the tone of voice or the connection with the emotion. And all of a sudden, I was in tears.
Mm,
And I thought, oh gosh, I was not expecting that. I was not expecting to be triggered like that. And what I discovered was that I kind of hadn't really understood how valuable it is to focus on the emotions. And maybe what I'd done in my previous work in therapy was the tendency to intellectualize it. So that was not allow myself to be with the emotion. So, and in that particular case, it was some grief work that I needed to do. There's a
mm,
lot of sadness there that hadn't really been settled. I'd found ways to avoid that emotion. And it just happened that on that particular moment that Paul had spoken about this, and I thought, "Oh," and then it arose for me. So, and I do say this to people. I say, this is really important, that you do need to look after yourself, because you can get triggered, and that's okay, because that's why we build the foundations for you to do your own compassionate mind training too, is so that you're not completely overwhelmed if that occurs. And I was able to do that, so I was able to get in touch with somebody and get some support and process that grief.
Yes, when we bring compassion to ourselves, and when we bring that kind of warmth and that the sort of the caring tone and the real desire to understand our own suffering and perhaps how to help alleviate it, it can open some floodgates, can't it? That's one of the things that people can be really reticent about, or even fearful of, with self-compassion, I suppose, is the way that it can mean we really get in touch with things like grief and sadness, or rage sometimes, or fear and dread, or other emotions. And yet the thing to kind of then do is to sort of bring compassion to that, I suppose, isn't it? And it
Yes.
is a bit like an onion, you're right.
Yes. So we try to explain it to people, but I think it takes a while sometimes to really sink in, and that's okay.
Where do you see the future of CFT heading? I suppose you're really in the sort of the center of the orbit there at the Compassionate Mind Foundation, and there's so much great work happening there and coming out of there. Where's it all heading, or what are some of the innovations? Maybe two innovations in learning and training of CFT.
Well, I think the main one that's on the horizon at the moment is during the past few years, both when I was at the university running it as well as with the foundation, there's always been a number of people that have said, I'm not a clinician, but I do want to use the approach. So there may be a healthcare worker in another setting, such as physiotherapists or any others. And the other group of people are people that are managers or leaders in some way. And as you probably know, there is a great swell now, great demand for looking at using this model in management in healthcare settings, in various other settings. And, in the UK, we've even got a movement to look at compassion in politics. So I think what we're going to be developing is different sort of pathways, so that people can begin to think about how we use the approach in different contexts. So I think that's one of the main things for the future. And the other thing is that, as you know, some countries have their own training in CFT, and some countries want us to help them to develop that training. So we're working with various countries so that we can grow the model in its own culture, in its own language. So that's what we'd like to see. So it doesn't, maintain a kind of UK-centric perspective, because culture and language is so important. So those are a couple of things that I see it heading.
Yes, there's some interesting broadening of the whole approach, isn't there? It began, I suppose, as a psychotherapy, and that's certainly Paul's background, and you and I too, and others. But it's kind of broadening, and compassion in business or management or leadership, and compassion in education and higher education, or compassion in politics, as you mentioned. There's a big push there. So that's all very interesting to see where that goes, and to see how that maybe helps to change some of the social structures that we seem to be finding ourselves in, not least the divisiveness that is,
Yeah.
seems to be growing in certain quarters and across cultures, I guess, too, broadening
Mm,
to other cultures, in other languages. There's no doubt certain adaptations, I suppose, that might be
mm.
needed if CFT were to be brought to other cultures around the world. So, yeah.
Yes, and so we've kind of been, reflecting on that with the people that come on the course, because it has been international. So we have students from Australia, from Iceland, from Canada, from uh, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil. And so that brings that cultural richness. And because it's not just a course, then people become part of the community, and they're going to help us shape the future of CFT, and think, well, how does compassion translate into Polish? Does it have more of for example, does it have more of a flavour of pity rather than compassion?
Mm,
So how can we make sure that we maintain the integrity of what we're talking about?
mm, yes,
So
and
it's
mm,
exciting to have those sort of,
yeah,
discussions and reflections.
yeah. Even from the UK to Australia, but there's probably interesting little kind of subtleties there about
Yeah.
what is compassion and those kind of things. I thought I'd ask you a little quirky question for the last one, a little bit just for fun, but if you could have a sort of any superpower to enhance, I guess, your work in promoting or teaching and disseminating compassion, what would the superpower be, and why?
Okay, well, the superpower would be to have the capacity to speak every single language, so
Gotcha.
that I could, yeah, speak to everybody in their own language, and to
Ah,
understand the nuances of cultural difference. I'd just love to be able to do that.
yes. Oh, I was so curious to hear what your answer would be, but yeah, I think that's a perfect one. Like, I sometimes so admire various people, colleagues of ours from Europe who can speak 5 or 6 languages, and
Yes.
I can only speak one. That would be a wonderful superpower. Well, I'll let you go shortly, but if people were interested in, I guess, being in touch or finding out more about you or your work, or perhaps even the course that you're running there at the Compassionate Mind Foundation, how might they find you?
The best way would be to go onto the Compassionate Mind Foundation website, and then there's a particular sort of page there about the diploma, or they can, of course, email me directly at wendy.wood@compassionatemind.co.uk.
Beautiful. Excellent. Well, I know that it's a popular course, and I hope also that this drums up some business, because the more CFT out there, the better, in my view. So
Yes,
anyway,
yeah.
well, Dr. Wendy Wood, thank you very much for chatting with me on Compassion in a T-shirt.
Thank you very much. Thank you.